Thank you, Chris. I live across the street from the former home of author, poet, and artist Evaleen Stein. Evaleen was one of the literary giants of the golden age of Indiana literature, when many nationally and internationally acclaimed works were created by Hoosier authors. Yet Evaleen received little acknowledgement. From 1897 to 1923, Evaleen published 300 poems, 13 children's novels, and 3 books of poetry. She translated books in Japanese and Italian. Her vast artistic body of work included gorgeous illuminations and watercolors. Nature was her muse. Still today, children read her works in print and on the internet or listen to her poems on YouTube. James Whitcomb Riley was Evaleen's longtime friend and mentor. Notably, Evaleen was a 35-year member of an illustrious Lafayette group that bestowed upon her the distinguished title of Poet Laureate of Parlor Club. In 1910, Evaleen and her mother built their little house on the hillside at 708 Hitt Street, complete with a lush side garden. Evaleen named their sprightly cottage Little House of Dreams. Above the fireplace, she painted this verse: "Peace and joy come sit beside this our hearth and here abide. Share our firelight's rosy gleam. Bless our little house of dreams." I see Evaleen's Little House of Dreams from my circa 1900 house on 7th Street, where my writing studio is in a former sleeping porch that holds court over my own back garden. I like to think Evaleen and I are kindred writers, a century apart in time, sharing the same inspirational neighborhood ether. The current residents, like Evaleen, believe in dreams and making children happy. Mr. and Mrs. Claus, a.k.a. Wayne and Margie Wolzak, now live at 708 Hitt. Appropriate, because children continue to read Evaleen's 1914 book, The Christmas Porringer, with a 5-star reviews on Goodreads written just last December. That's Smidge, the dog. There is no historical marker telling passers-by that a great woman of letters once lived in the Little House of Dreams, or that the home was christened with a name full of hope and promise. To fully appreciate Evaleen's boundless artistic accomplishments, despite trials, how her art saved her, or rather, she saved herself through her art, we need to know her family, who greatly influenced the community and Purdue University. Evaleen's father, John A. Stein, came to Lafayette in 1861 to practice law. Before leaving to fight for the Union in the Civil War, he married Virginia Ginny Tomlinson of Logansport. They were married by Dr. Martin Post, the father of Lucy Coulter, who was married to Stanley Coulter, Purdue's Dean of Science and first Dean of Men. Evaleen was a lifelong friend of the Coulters, also members of Parlor Club. The Coulters sent Evaleen flowers on holidays, and she wrote lyrical letters of gratitude in response, including personalized poems. Evaleen was born in 1863, 1 year after her brother, Orth. She was a shy child with lovely dark-fringed eyes. In 1866, when she was 3, her father successfully ran for the Indiana Senate. As a friend of John Purdue and a senator, John Stein influenced the location of Purdue University. There was a debate in the Indiana legislature over where a new land-grant college would be established in Indiana. Through the efforts of Senator Stein, legislators accepted the offers of John Purdue and other local citizens to establish the college in Tippecanoe County. When Evaleen was 7, her father was appointed to Purdue's Board of Trustees and soon became secretary. According to Purdue Archives, John Stein is second only to John Purdue as the father of Purdue University. Yet, the second father of Purdue had financial difficulties. He worked 3 jobs. The trustees paid him modestly. He kept his law office and worked for the Republicans, but he made little money outside of Purdue. Evaleen and Orth grew up in a cultured home. Their parents read them stories, taught them to reason, notice, and draw. Yet Orth tested his parents daily and teased Evaleen. A talented writer and artist, Orth was 14 when he was hired by the Lafayette newspaper, The Courier, to illustrate the bizarre 1876 story of James Moon, who checked into the Lar Hotel with his portable guillotine and did away with himself by severing his own head into a soapbox. Orth carved 3 woodcut block prints to depict the gruesome scene. The Courier named him Master Orth Stein, and he continued to write and illustrate for the paper. By day, Orth played the respected lawyer's son, but at night he secretly made shady friends, tried cigars, whiskey, wild women, guns, and poker. He was fascinated with the dark underbelly of Lafayette and the world, and began writing newspaper stories filled with sensational half-truths. Meanwhile, Evaleen's life was quite different. As a child, she had suffered from rheumatic fever that left her with a weak heart. At age 15, she wrote of fleecy clouds, shooting stars, pine cones, Santa Claus, honeybees, church steeples, and mistletoe. She learned to bake, sew, and paint. She cultivated and arranged flowers. Her father built her a platform in their backyard where she fed and watched songbirds. She read the works of famous poets and lost herself in volumes about history, religion, and travel. Unknowingly, she was priming for her life as a noted writer and artist who would paint beautiful scenes with brushes and words. But Evaleen's accomplishments and accolades would come later. First, she would experience great shame and loss. At age 16, Orth was named the Courier's city editor. He wrote poetry for the paper, but also invented wild stories for various newspapers around the country, often under aliases. His life of running with the wrong crowd came to a heartbreaking crescendo for the Stein family when Orth wrote for the Kansas City Star. Orth was infatuated with a woman who was the mistress of another man. When they met in the woman's hotel room, Orth fatally shot the other man, claiming it was self-defense. The Lafayette newspaper wrote of Orth's scandal, and the Steins were crushed by the shame. Evaleen, age 20, was sent to stay with her cousins in Logansport, and her parents took the train to Kansas City for Orth's trial in July 1883. Tearfully, Virginia Stein testified on behalf of her son, stating that Orth was nearsighted, a point of defense. However, Orth was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Again, the shocking story was in newspapers around the country. Orth was granted a new trial and released on bail. Friends of the Steins raised the money. His parents were in despair. John had chest pains. He worried, blamed himself for his family troubles, and lost sleep. He felt bankrupt of money, esteem, and friendships. Legal clients avoided him. Neighbors looked the other way. The Steins stopped going to church. It hurt too much to be seen. Again, Evaleen stayed in Logansport, while again her parents left for Kansas City. This time, Orth was acquitted. The Steins returned to Lafayette, and Orth began writing for the Lafayette Journal. Yet more tragedy. 5 months later, with his family at his bedside, John Stein, age 53, took his last breath. Orth wrote a glowing newspaper obituary for his father that ran the next morning. However, as author Bob Kriebel wrote, quote, Orth conveniently left out what many people muttered with great certainty. John Stein's own son killed him sure as hell. End quote. Evaleen and her mother were devastated by John's death, while Orth went on about his business as if unperturbed. Virginia knew her son was irresponsible, yet a mother's love prevails, and when he wanted to start his own newspaper, The Comet, Virginia agreed to let him use her insurance money. Not surprisingly, Orth ran into financial troubles. Evaleen and Virginia left Lafayette to stay with family in Logansport. The reason why came out in the newspaper. Orth had spent all of his mother's money forging checks in her name. Virginia had to sell the few Comet assets to quickly gain funds. The Lafayette Courier knew of Orth's disgrace, but with great kindness towards Virginia and Evaleen printed only this, quote, "Out of respect and commiseration for two grief-burdened women, we refrain from making public use of our knowledge. We would not at a feather's weight to the mortal agony a mother and sister must suffer at the cruel discovery that their loved one is unworthy of their affection. For the sake of those noble women whom all love and revere, our lips are dumb to the sins of Orth Harper Stein." End quote. A chasm formed between the Stein women and Orth. Facing bankruptcy, Virginia and Evaleen had to reinvent their lives. Then, as spring approached, Evaleen, age 22, had good news. On April 25, 1886, her first poem was published in the Indianapolis Journal titled April. The last stanza could be a metaphor for Evaleen's life. It reads, "Oh, April, April, every hour charms with its changing graces, when breaking buds burst into flower and sun and storm change places." For Evaleen, the sun and storm would change places. She and Virginia would improve their lives through art and literature. John Stein's former law partner and author, DeWitt Wallace, a member of Parlor Club, encouraged Evaleen to join the new Western Association of Writers. Other notable members were James Whitcomb Riley, Booth Tarkington, Lew Wallace, Meredith Nicholson, and Purdue professor of English literature and Parlor Club member Emma Montgomery McCrae. Attorney and Purdue trustee John Kofroth, founder of what is today called Stewart and Brannigan Law Firm, found Virginia a job at Lafayette's Public Library located at Columbia and 6th Streets. She was promoted to head librarian and would serve for more than 30 years. While Orth was in and out of jail in various cities with newspapers printing stories of his escapades, Evaleen continued to have poems published month after month. Many of Evaleen's poems and paintings were inspired by the Kankakee River, where she and Virginia would go with family friends Cyrus Gordon and Annette Winter Ball. The painting The Bunk depicts the popular summer camp built there by a group of Lafayette men in the 1890s. Evaleen's paintings were exhibited and won prizes in New York, New Orleans, and Chicago galleries. Her first nationally published poem was The Little Fir Trees, printed in St. Nicholas Children's Magazine. It is one of her best-known works. Still today, children love the repetition in this stanza. "Little evergreens grow, 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 little evergreens grow." In spring 1890, during a visit to Indianapolis, Evaleen first met James Whitcomb Riley, who had admired her work for some time. Riley, the Hoosier poet, had authored his best-selling Little Orphaned Annie and The Raggedy Man. He and Evaleen began a 20-year correspondence that lasted until Riley's death. Occasionally, Evaleen would send her works in progress with long letters she marked personal. She wrote with a friendly, respectful flourish. Riley mailed Evaleen his own books, and she gushed with humble gratitude. On holidays, he sent her flowers, valentines, and bonbons. When Evaleen's poem Impatient appeared in the Indianapolis Journal, Riley immediately wrote Evaleen and said, quote, "Your poem this morning is as sacredly beautiful as the day and shows, I think, both human heart and art in simplest, therefore most perfect, unison. You are of the elect. Be assured of that. The first book you print will prove as much to the literary world too. I honestly believe and pray." End quote. Evaleen, age 29, began considering a book while studying decorative art at the Art Institute of Chicago with the hope that the skill would help her make more money. Virginia hired Evaleen to work part-time at the library where she helped children select storybooks, and they loved her. She read the children her own simple rhymes and adventure stories, the early seeds of the children's novels she would eventually author. The nation's bicycle craze began in the 1890s, and Orth sent Evaleen a bike, then called a wheel. It gave her a new freedom, although one day she rode too far and her heart sent her danger signals. She wrote a jaunty poem for Woman's Sentinel magazine titled A Wheel Song. And it goes like this. Then ho! For the wheel with its strength of steel, yet blessed buoyance of sky-born things, and the rush of the near and crystalline clear, sweet breath of the summer that sings in the ear, like harps of 1,000 strings. Oh, wild and free is the joy to me, to breast the breezes and whirl along, to skim the ground till the pulses bound and the heart bursts into song. Evaleen met Indianapolis writer George S. Cotman at a meeting of the Western Association of Writers. Cotman founded the Indiana Magazine of History. He raved about her work and said that she led the poets of Indiana. For several years, like Riley, he urged her to compile her poetry into a book and seek a publisher. Finally, she heeded her friend's advice and began gathering poems for a book. Her childhood friend, Bruce Burt Rogers, visited Lafayette from his new job as a book designer with Houghton Mifflin Company of Boston. Evaleen had encouraged Rogers when he was an up-and-coming designer, and he remained her devoted friend. Rogers designed Purdue's first official seal and its diploma. He offered to take Evaleen's manuscript back to Boston to show to publishing houses. And in 1897, Copeland and Day published One Way to the Woods. The delicate breast pocket book of handmade papers sold for 75 cents. 500 copies were printed. Evaleen dedicated her first book to her father. It received praise and sold well. 500 more copies were printed. Next, one of Evaleen's juvenile stories set in olden days called Troubadour Tales was printed in St. Nicholas magazine. She sent it to Riley, calling it her first ever effort at story making. By 1901, Orth was living a stable life in New Orleans when he became ill with consumption, tuberculosis. Evaleen and Virginia traveled to his bedside, where he died at age 39. They buried him in Lafayette's Greenbush Cemetery next to his father. Evaleen's book, Among the Trees, is dedicated to Orth. The last stanza of In the Moonlight reads, O brother mine, could it be true, thine own dear presence hovers near, to comfort with this heavenly peace thy little sister here. In May of 1888, Evaleen joined the Parlor Club. As poet laureate, she wrote several poems specifically for the club, reciting them from memory. Her first paper was titled Poets of the Far North, with a poem she penned about the Icelandic people. In 1894, she presented Ode, with the cover illustrated by Bruce Rogers. On the Parlor Club's 20th anniversary, a 7-course dinner was served at the home of Purdue Professor of Botany Joseph C. Arthur, club president. The club minutes state, quote, the souvenir program and menu cards were handsomely embellished in watercolors by Miss Stein and were as artistic as anything of the kind ever seen here, end quote. In 1903, the Parlor Club celebrated its 26th anniversary, and Evaleen invited James Whitcomb Riley as a Parlor Club dinner guest. The anniversary dinner happened to fall on the day of Riley's presentation in Purdue's Eliza Fowler Hall. Evaleen mailed Riley a letter marked personal and enclosed the Parlor Club program. She wrote, quote, My dear Mr. Riley, now as you may see from the program, our anniversary celebration this year falls on November 20th, which is the same date on which your reading is announced for Lafayette. Naturally, when we discovered this, the unanimous and enthusiastic expression was, how delightful it would be if we could have Mr. Riley for our guest of honor. End quote. Riley accepted, and Evaleen sent a follow-up letter. Quote, we are all so delighted that you are coming to our dinner. After the event, Evaleen wrote Riley again, quote, your presence at our little club affair ranked a red-letter day in all the 26 years' annals of the Parlor Club. I am most gratefully your friend, Evaleen Stein. 3 years later, when Evaleen planned the program for the Parlor Club's annual dinner in December 1906, the event glowed with her creativity. It was held at the new home of William Potter on State Street, recently moved there from the St. Louis World's Fair where he purchased it. The dinner was the first event to be held at the home, today the Hahn Museum. Evaleen wrote, "It really was a christening." She described her planning for the regal event, quote, "We set our table in the big entrance hall, which I particularly admire, though I think the whole house beautiful. The large oval opening in the upper hall, which came directly over the table, we hung with green garlands. On the table were silver candlesticks with white candles and red shades, while down the center of the table ran a mass of flat sprays of southern smilax, and at each place were a red flower and a name card in holly design." End quote. 4 members were absent, and President Potter conveyed regrets. Then a band hidden upstairs began to play. The 4 missing Parlor Club members appeared and descended the double staircase. They came as Benjamin Franklin, leading Anne Hutchinson down one side, and the captain of the Mayflower escorting Pocahontas down the other. After introductions, each told stories from their historic lives. Evaleen wrote to a friend, quote, "All were very clever and amusing. I wound up the evening with a toast in verse to the new house, calling down blessings, and we all stood up and drank this toast in claret punch." The following spring, Riley planned an event that profoundly changed Evaleen's life. To recognize Evaleen's literary talent, authors of Indiana's golden age of literature provided readings of their works at Purdue's Eliza Fowler Hall. Joining Riley were humorist and playwright George Ade, best-selling author Meredith Nicholson, and novelist and Purdue trustee Charles Major. Purdue President Winthrop Stone, a Parlor Club friend, served as master of ceremonies. Evaleen read selections from her book Among the Trees again, closing the evening with her poem The Little Fir Trees. The 1,600 spectators well remembered the poem's signature refrain, "Grow, little evergreens, grow." She finished reading, and they applauded loudly. She sat frozen, unsure of the protocol. Riley leaned in, and playing off the words of her poem, he whispered, "Go, little Evaleen, go." She then stood and bowed. Ticket sales netted about $1,000, although some newspapers reported it was $2,000. Evaleen used the money for a trip to Europe, where she and her mother visited the lands of Evaleen that Evaleen longed to see, that inspired scenes from future storybooks. Evaleen wrote Riley about the event, quote, "I am so overwhelmed by your kindness that all the things I long to say in appreciation must go unvoiced, because my heart is too full. Never in all of my life has anything so profoundly touched me. I can scarcely think of it without my eyes filling with tears. I still sometimes wonder if it is not all some marvelous fairy dream." End quote. Evaleen's literary and artistic works are copious. We may never know of all, as many were unsigned or lost to eternity. She promoted Royal Brand baking flour with her amusing poem titled A Ballad of Sad Biscuits. She helped sell Liberty bonds with her opus The Thrift Stamp Speaks. She produced commercial decorative art for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Her popular Little Cousin books each tell the story of a young cousin from a different country. She wrote a Purdue hymn and centennial odes for the Battle of Tippecanoe and Indiana statehood. Her illumination of the 23rd Psalm earned an honorable mention at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco. Virginia hung it on the library wall. A floral painting by Evaleen still graces the Indiana room at the Tippecanoe County Public Library. Evaleen translated 2 gorgeous volumes of Japanese poems. Yet with all of her success, she needed money. Upkeep on the Little House of Dreams cost dearly. In 1912, at the age of 49, she wrote letters about a possible Purdue Library position to her Parlor Club friends, Purdue President Winthrop Stone and Director of Libraries William Hepburn. Evaleen heard nothing back for a year. When President Stone finally wrote he told Evaleen there was no place for her at Purdue, he said a position in the library called for someone who had been trained. Evaleen was insulted. After all, she had years of experience at the public library. Every afternoon she worked in place of her mother, who at 72 still held the position as head librarian. She wrote to Hepburn saying, quote, "While I had determined to keep to myself my thoughts on the subject, the last letter coolly placing me in the ranks of the utterly untrained in the work for which I asked has so exasperated me that I simply must give a little expression to what I think. I did not ask for a place in the Purdue Library merely on the grounds of a, quote, love for the souls of books. I asked for it on the strength of many years' arduous experience in practical library work," end quote. She ended her letter with this bold statement, quote, "I have been rather unkindly treated by the institution which owes its very existence and its location in Lafayette to my father, more than to any other person aside from Mr. Purdue himself," end quote. Evaleen died from heart failure at age 60 on December 11, 1923. Her funeral was at the Little House of Dreams. Pallbearers included Stanley Coulter and Joseph Arthur. She was buried next to her father and brother. Virginia Stein passed away 11 months later. A month before she died, Evaleen was interviewed by a reporter who wrote after her death, quote, "She spoke of the wonderful sunsets to be seen from her Hitt Street home, of the view across the hills toward the west. She cultivated a small rustic garden about her home and took much pleasure in it. Few Lafayette people knew and appreciated the literary genius which the city possessed," end quote. Children and their teachers appreciated Evaleen's brilliance. For more than a decade after her death, she was remembered annually on her birthday by the Lafayette Teachers Federation. Yearly, a memorial wreath was placed on her grave, and school programs and WVAA radio featured children reading and singing her poems. Stanley Coulter gave tributes, urging the preservation of Evaleen's work. In a 1931 address to the Lafayette Teachers Federation, Dean Stanley Coulter said, quote, "Today, as we look back upon the years when Evaleen Stein was with us, we realize we took too much for granted. We were so accustomed to the easy grace of her utterances, to her cheerful willingness to respond to our manifold demands upon her time and talents, that we failed to appreciate the full measure of her genius. We were in the presence of greatness and failed to realize it." Thank you.